In this video, I'm going to take you to 4 cemeteries where the victims of Jack the Ripper are buried. Most of the footage that you will see was filmed during the last week of August 2024, albeit in the case of one of the victims who now has a new memorial stone, I will feature earlier footage for comparison purposes. So without further ado, let us begin our tour with a visit to the City of London Cemetery at Manor Park, the final resting place of Mary Ann Polly Nichols, widely acknowledged as having been the first victim of Jack the Ripper. The funeral of Mary Nichols took place on Thursday the 6th of September 1888, and great secrecy was adopted in order to keep morbid sightseers at bay. According to the Globe newspaper that evening, this afternoon, the mutilated remains of Mary Ann Nichols, the victim of the revolting crime in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, were buried. The woman's father did his best to keep the day and hour of the funeral secret, but the matter seems to have become known, for crowds lined the streets for hours before the procession started. Soon after 2 o'clock, the body was conveyed from the mortuary to the shop of Mr. Smith, the undertaker, in Hanbury Street, where it awaited the arrival of the mourners. The body was enclosed in a plain polished elm coffin with the ordinary inscription of the name, age, etc. on the coffin plate. The cortege consisted of a hearse and 2 mourning coaches, the chief mourners being the father of the deceased, Mr. Edward Walker, and the son of the deceased. The husband, although paying the expenses of the funeral, was not present. The procession started from Hanbury Street in the presence of a small crowd, which was easily kept in order by half a dozen policemen. But as it turned into Baker's Row and passed the corner of Bucks Row, the scene of the murder, to get into Whitechapel Road, en route for Ilford Cemetery, it was met by a large concourse of people who continued to line the thoroughfare for some distance. On arrival at the City of London Cemetery, the small procession made its way to the grave, where the mourners watched as the coffin was lowered into the ground and Mary Ann Nichols was laid to rest. The exact site of her grave is now believed to lie beneath one of the cemetery's roadways, although the authorities maintain this memorial plaque to her in the Garden of Remembrance, to which people come from all over the world to place flowers on it and to spend a few quiet moments remembering her, whilst also reflecting on the tragedy of her life and the horror of her death. Some of them even leave coins here, presumably in remembrance of the fact that Mary Ann Polly Nichols met her untimely end because she lacked the meagre sum of 4pence that would have paid for her bed for the night. 2 days after Mary Nichols had been laid to rest, Annie Chapman was murdered in Hanbury Street, Spitalfields. Her funeral took place on Friday the 14th of September, and great secrecy was maintained to prevent a repeat of the scenes that had attended the funeral of Mary Nichols the previous week. The East London Advertiser and Tower Hamlets Independent on Saturday the 15th of September published the following account of the proceedings. Funeral of the victim. The arrangements for the funeral of the poor woman were carried out with the utmost secrecy, and the time fixed for the ceremony was known only to the relatives of the deceased and the undertaker, Mr. H. Hawes, of Hunt Street, Mile End, New Town. All the expenses were met by the relatives, the funeral being a private one. On Friday morning at 7 o'clock, a hearse was sent to the mortuary in Montague Street, and the body was quietly removed by the undertaker's men. There was no crowd or excitement, as the matter had been kept profoundly secret. The coffin in which the body was placed was a black-covered elm coffin, and the plate bore the words, Annie Chapman, died September 8th, aged 48 years. The hearse then drove round to Hunt Street, where it waited till 9 o'clock, when a start was made for Manor Park Cemetery, the interment taking place there. No mourning coaches followed, as the relatives and friends of the deceased met the body at the cemetery. All the arrangements were carried out most satisfactorily, and there was no hitch of any kind. Today, all traces of Annie Chapman's grave have been lost. She lies somewhere in this section of Manor Park Cemetery, and until very recently, only this small memorial remembered her. However, in 2024, a new, more substantial memorial has been erected on the edge of the mound above the plaque, where, sadly, being the most prominent feature in this section of the cemetery, it is often covered in bird droppings, as can be seen in this footage, which I filmed in the last week of August. I did try to clean it up a little, but the droppings are fairly ingrained into the stone. However, it does make a fitting and substantial memorial to Annie Chapman, the second victim of Jack the Ripper. Elizabeth Stride's funeral took place on Saturday the 6th of October, and she was laid to rest here at the East London Cemetery in the quietest possible manner and at the expense of the parish, according to newspaper reports. As a consequence, her burial received very little press coverage other than the aforementioned scant details. In recent years, the cemetery authorities have marked her final resting place with this elaborate grave and stone, and, as with the other victims, visitors now make pilgrimages to the cemetery to pay their respects and to lay flowers and other tributes, thus ensuring that long Liz Stride is not forgotten. Catherine Eddowes was buried at the City of London Cemetery on Monday the 8th of October. The Eastern Post gave a full account of the day's proceedings in its edition of Saturday the 13th of October. Funeral of the Mitre Square victim. Many hundreds of people assembled outside the City Mortuary in Golden Lane at 1 o'clock on Monday for the purpose of witnessing the removal of Catherine Eddowes' body to Ilford for interment. The departure of the funeral cortege was fixed for 1:30, and at that hour the road was practically blocked, some publicity having been given to the arrangements, and the hour enabling workpeople to be present. The relatives of the murdered woman had accepted the offer of Mr. G.C. Hawkes, undertaker, of 41A Banner Street, who is a vestryman of No. 4 Ward, St. Luke's, to bear the whole expense of the funeral, and the authorities of the cemetery had consented to remit the usual charges. The coffin was of polished elm with oak mouldings and black furniture, and bore on the nameplate the simple inscription, Catherine Eddowes, died 30th of September 1888, aged 43 years. It was conveyed in an open glass car drawn by a pair of horses, and was followed by a mourning coach in which were John Kelly, 4 of the dead woman's sisters, Mrs. Eliza Gold, Mrs. Elizabeth Fisher, Mrs. Harriet Jones, and Mrs. Emma Jones, with Mrs. Mary Eddowes and her 2 daughters. The procession started punctually, but along Old Street and Great Eastern Street it was only able to progress at a very slow rate in consequence of the crowd, although the city police in the first instance, and subsequently the Metropolitan Constables, preserved order admirably. All along Old Street the crowd was specially dense, and at the top of Commercial Street and the end of Whitechapel Road knots of people had congregated. But after leaving Great Eastern Street, the hearse and coach quickened their pace, and the spectators were soon left behind. At Ilford Cemetery, nearly 500 people had assembled to witness the interment. The service, both in the chapel and at the grave, was conducted by the Reverend J. Dunscombe, the cemetery chaplain, who made no special reference to the murder. The generosity of Mr. Hawkes was the subject of much favourable comment, and people contrasted the interment with that of Elizabeth Stride, who was buried on Saturday in the quietest possible manner and at the expense of the parish. And thus Catherine Eddowes was laid to rest. Today, as with Mary Nichols, no sign of her final resting place survives, although there is a memorial plaque to her in the Garden of Remembrance on the opposite side of the path to Mary Nichols's memorial, and to this day people come here to leave flowers and coins to her memory. And so we complete our tour with a visit to the place where Mary Kelly lies at rest, St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. There was initially some confusion in the newspapers as to when the funeral would actually take place. As the Nottingham Journal reported on Thursday the 15th of November, the funeral of the murdered woman will not take place until after the arrival from Wales of some of her relatives and friends who were expecting to reach London last evening. It appears that no relatives of Mary Kelly had in fact been traced, and had therefore not made the journey to London, so the next day the newspapers announced that her funeral would take place on the following Monday. The Walthamstow and Leyton Guardian published a detailed account of the funeral the following Saturday. The funeral of Mary Jeanette Kelly, the victim of the latest Whitechapel murder, took place on Monday at Leytonstone Cemetery in the presence of a number of people. An hour before the remains left the mortuary, many hundreds of persons assembled around Shoreditch Church and watched in silence the funeral arrangements. The coffin, which was of elm and oak with metal fittings, was placed on an open hearse drawn by 2 horses, and was followed by 2 mourning carriages containing the man Joseph Barnet, who lived with the deceased, and several of the unfortunate woman's associates who gave evidence at the inquest. The coffin bore the following inscription: Marie Jeanette Kelly, died November 9th, 1888, aged 25 years. And on it were placed 2 crowns and a cross made of heartsease and white flowers. The cross had been subscribed for by the murdered woman's associates in Dorset Street. Attached to it was a large card bearing the words, "A last tribute of respect to Mary Kelly. May she rest in peace, and may her murderer be brought to justice." The whole of the funeral expenses are defrayed by Mr. Wilton, who for 50 years has acted as sexton to St. Leonard's, Shoreditch, in the mortuary of which the body has been lying. At 12:30, as the coffin was borne from the mortuary, the bell of the church was tolled, and the people outside, who now numbered several thousands, manifested the utmost sympathy, the crowd, for an East End one, being extremely orderly. Vehicles of various descriptions took up positions outside the church railings, and traffic was completely blocked until the hearse moved off. The funeral procession, which left Shoreditch Church at 1:45, made but slow progress through the crowds of people and vehicles. All along the route signs of sympathy were to be seen on every hand, and it was a very touching sight to witness many poor women of the class to which the deceased belonged greatly affected. The distance from Shoreditch Church to the cemetery at Leytonstone by road is about 6 miles, and the route traversed was Hackney Road, Cambridge Heath Road, Whitechapel Road and Stratford. In the Whitechapel Road, the crowds on each side of the roadway were very great, and there was a considerable amount of emotion manifested. The appearance of the roadway throughout the whole journey was remarkable, owing to the hundreds of men and women who escorted the coffin on each side, and who had to keep up a sharp trot in many places. But the crowd rapidly thinned away when, getting into the suburbs, the car and coaches broke into a trot. The cemetery was reached at 2:00. The Reverend Father Columban, with 2 acolytes and a cross-bearer, met the body at the door of the little chapel of St. Patrick, and the coffin was carried at once to the grave in the northeastern corner. Barnet and the poor women who had accompanied the funeral knelt on the cold clay by the side of the grave, and the service was read by Father Columban. The coffin was incensed, lowered, and then sprinkled with holy water, and the simple ceremony ended. The floral ornaments were afterwards raised to be placed upon the grave, and the filling up was completed in a few moments, and was watched by a small crowd of people. There was a very large concourse of people outside the gates, who were refused admission until after the funeral was over. And so Mary Kelly was laid to rest at St. Patrick's Cemetery, where over the ensuing years the site of her grave was reused for further burials, with the result that the exact resting place of her remains is now uncertain. However, a simple memorial has been placed over her approximate resting place, and this is now visited by people from all over the world who come here to leave flowers and trinkets to her memory. It bears the poignant inscription, "In loving memory of Marie Jeanette Kelly, none but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever." In recent years there have been several reports that her body was going to be exhumed, but these thankfully have come to nothing, and personally I cannot see any reason for exhuming her remains other than satisfying morbid curiosity. Wherever she and the other victims lie, may they all rest in peace, and may people continue to visit the approximate sites of their graves and keep their memories alive.